can't be.
All right.
Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you for listening to WXOX 97.1 FM in Louisville, Kentucky. This is Artist Talk with LVA, and I'm your host, Keith Waits. The show is produced by Louisville Visual Art. And this year, Louisville Visual Art, for the first time, will actually have a presence, a booth, at the St. James Art Festival on September 29th, October 1st, October 2nd. And we will be featuring an artist, and he's here to talk with me now. Darrenn Canton is an artist from Washington, D.C., who specializes in fantasy art, children's illustration, and cartooning. His work emphasizes humor, wit, and character. He graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University with a BFA in Communication Arts and now resides in Louisville, Kentucky with his dog, Trumpet, who is asleep and will not be joining us, but we're thinking of Trumpet. Darrenn, thanks for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to get into this immediately. I've seen your work in person, met you, when we were sort of talking about who would be joining us. And also I should say, just so this is sort of an extension of Desmond Stepp's program. She's our outreach coordinator, my delightful coworker, and who developed this program called Local Muse, where LVA will set up the booth, pay the fees, whatever, to have artists be featured in these different kinds of public events around the city. So this is an extension of the Local Muse. So that's her program, and I want to make sure I call her out. But so I want to get into this. We were talking and warming up before we started recording here. You work primarily as an illustrator. And your work is the stuff that I've seen particularly was fantasy art in kind of a classic sense of thinking about Tolkien and all the other people who have written Tolkien-esque sort of adventures and things like that, sort of in that vein. So let's start with how did you come to be that sort of artist instead of something else? Like, what led you into doing that kind of imagery?
That's just the sort of imagery that's always appealed to me. So growing up in Washington, D.C., I was a nerd. I liked fantasy art. I liked Dungeons and Dragons. I liked Magic the Gathering. All of that stuff appealed to me. And it just kind of started bleeding into my work. I kind of want to preface it by saying that I kind of came into art late. And by late, I mean like my early to mid 20s. So originally when I went to college, my original major intended was music. And it wasn't until my third year of college that I switched majors. I started really pursuing art as a career versus a hobby. And all of the things that I did, like when I was a kid, all the things I used to doodle and scribble, that just naturally bled into the work that I did. And it's kind of become a defining feature of my work now.
Were you a big fantasy reader?
Kind of. I did read Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. I did not read The Silmarillion, which is a point of consternation to a few of my friends.
I'm with you, right? I'm right there with you, brother.
That's kind of the litmus test for Tolkien fans is if you have read through the Silmarillion, and I have not, and that kind of prompts a little bit of a side eye from some of my other friends who are really, really big into J.R.R. Tolkien. So, but it wasn't one of those things where I was at the library every week getting contemporary fantasy from guys like Brandon Sanderson. It was more so just movies, video games, popular media, and then from there just kind of adapting the work that I saw to what I did.
Right. Well, and so we were touching on this in our pre-conversation too. So you're an illustrator, but you do pieces for your own edification. You just work.
Yeah.
But then do you get commissions and things like that, or
I do. Most of the work that I do now, most of the stuff on my website, most of the work that I'll be having with me at the Louisville Visual Arts setup at St. James is work that I did for myself. And so it's interesting that when we were talking earlier before the show about the distinction between fine art and illustration, I remember in school, one of my professors said that you're not really an illustrator until you've been published. And for me, I haven't really gotten to that big publication point. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that I kind of like doing work for myself. And so it's still illustrative and still visual storytelling, but if it's not being published or printed or shown on a website, is it really an illustration? I think that's kind of an existential question. And if you ask a dozen illustrators or artists, you'll get a dozen different answers.
Well, and your stuff, you know, it again, what I've seen, which is just a sort of representative sample, but you brought into our office one time, and on your website too. I've seen some things, but you seem to there's a lot of monsters, and they're not always scary. Sometimes they seem to be kind of like, you know, fun, like maybe engaging monsters, but you do seem to be drawn to doing those kind of unusual forms and characters.
It's one of those things where I think on one version of my website, I described myself as I draw and paint monsters. It's difficult. I can't really psychoanalyze myself about why the monsters appeal to me. Maybe it's because monsters are always being thrown under the bus, seen as the bad guy, and I kind of want to present them in a light that still is true to them, but isn't by default derogatory, I would say. Kind of exploring how the viewer engages with a subject depending on that sort of thing. Like how can you create an ogre to look endearing?
Well, I think the obvious appeal of monsters, it's kind of like actors talking about playing villains, right? It's like that there's a lot of darkness and depth, and but there's also, you know, you can kind of make a monster whatever you want. There's no limit. I think a lot of times you are looking at like ogres, trolls, those kinds of sort of traditional sort of character types, but that there's a beauty in the ugliness of the characters.
Oh yeah, I think you put it better than I could. Where it's not like really leaning into the ugliness, but sort of like it's been years since I've done art history, so I don't really want to say the wrong thing, but there have been movements in art where self-portraits and portraiture have just been kind of lay it all out there. I believe the phrase is warts and all. Yeah. Where it just sort of presents what it is without really sugarcoating it. And that's kind of what the aim that I have in my work. It emphasizes a lot of texture and a lot of character and a lot of grittiness. And it doesn't really shy away from presenting those sorts of things.
Well, and when we we're also talking about the distinction between like illustrator and for lack of a better term, fine artist. But you know, I really like your work. I sort of came up the same way, you know, when I was in high school and I was drawing and I was the guy that drew, you know, in my sort of circle of people. And you know, I was looking at Frank Frazetta and Boris Vallejo, and I was doing those kinds of drawings just for fun and for presents for people and stuff like that. So it's a lot of fun to do, but it seems like a lot of illustration. Like Frazetta seems very much like, for example, almost like an expressionist in the way he paints, you know, like, so I think you can make those sorts of ties in the stylistic approach and how they happen in the same in illustration versus fine art, and really the point I'm trying to make is, of course, and I think you agree, is that there really is not that big a distinction. You know, I mean, I could put one of your things on my wall just as easy as I could put some abstract painting. In fact, I might prefer to put one of your pieces on my wall as opposed to an abstract painting. It's just a matter of taste. But
Yeah. No,
talk a little bit about how you view that
uh,
distinction in your own work, in your own life.
so it's interesting that you mentioned Boris Vallejo.
Uh-huh.
Most years, at least pre-pandemic, every year, pretty much pre-pandemic, I would go up to a show in now it's in Reading, Pennsylvania, called IX, Imaginative Realism. And a lot of imaginative realist painters like Boris Vallejo is a yearly attendee of that. Another one is an artist by the name of Donato Giancola, who is a very renowned artist. But a lot of them come to the show in Pennsylvania, and it displays their work almost in a fine arts setting. Before it was in Reading, it was actually at the Museum of Fine Arts in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and that was a big selling point, was fantasy art in an art museum. There's been sort of this artificial distinction between illustration and fine art that I don't really feel benefits either genre, either category of art. Kind of segregating the two, where when you look at an image, you say, oh, that's an illustration. Oh, that's a fine arts painting. And I don't really feel that distinction needs to be there. For me personally, it's been a little bit frustrating that it's been there, because for me personally, I don't want to say that that's sort of limited my opportunities as an artist, but sometimes approaching galleries, approaching curators with my body of work, and they look at it and they say that this is illustration, we're looking for fine artists. It's been a little bit of a sore spot for me personally in my artistic career.
You ever, I mean, I think, you know, certainly the kind of work that you do, I get that distinction, but I also think that in the history of art, and you know, I haven't opened my Jansen and read it here lately, but you know, there are times when what is now considered the great art representative of a period of history is absolutely illustrative, you know, and you know, a lot of the mythologies and a lot of Christian imagery, you know, and stuff like that, are always telling stories and morality tales. They're very narrative oriented, and I think on some level that's maybe just what illustration is doing. It's just, again, sort of exploring narrative in a way that a lot of the fine art of the day sort of doesn't.
Yeah, and then the question is, like, where is the line? What is the distinguishing feature between fine art and illustration? And I don't really have an answer. If it was up to me, there wouldn't really be a distinction. It would all just be art. But that's been kind of interesting to see who decides where that line is and where that line is.
Have you ever gotten out of the have you ever explored different forms? Like, have you done a mural, for example?
Not really a mural. I did a collaborative mural commission for a game store in town. I've done a few pieces on public property. A few years ago, I was commissioned by the city of Jeffersonville to paint a utility box. And for any of the locals, it's the utility box outside of the Stockyards Bank on 10th Street in Jeffersonville. I've also done a couple of, I did one newspaper box for New Albany Public Libraries. but no like really large scale murals.
Because I could really see, I mean, that could be a really great mural to like and I've seen murals that do something like that. I haven't seen murals that with they've tended to be darker, sort of heavy metal landscapes, but like something with that maybe was a little bit more open and engaging with your kinds of characters. I don't know. Seems like a great idea. We should maybe we can figure out a place for you to do a mural here sometime in the future.
Sure, I'd love to.
I think it'd be a great mural. Um, so have you talked about you haven't had a lot of commissions and you haven't really reached the level of the publication, the sort of, which is, so again, when we talk about illustration, it's like, what is legitimacy with any given artist, right? So if you're a fine artist, it's about having solo shows and selling work. And if you're an illustrator, it's about selling, getting book covers or doing children's things like that.
And there are other ways like being published in annuals. There are illustration awards too, depending on the industry. And I haven't really quite reached that level yet. When I was a lot younger, that was kind of my driving focus. Like I wanted to make the cover of Spectrum one day. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that just the process of creation is the thing that I enjoy most. Once it's done, it feels nice to get likes and reshares on social media or having people say how nice it is. But the act of creation is what really drives me.
Yeah. I mean, I was just sitting here thinking like of a great idea, which I don't know if anybody's listening that would be in a position to motivate something like this. But in this day and age, when we talk about, the word troll takes on a whole meaning in terms of like cyberbullying and stuff like this. But I was thinking like, if anybody's going to do, there's all these kind of seminars and things about how to behave properly in the workplace, about how to treat your staff, how to not do all these terrible things that we've seen American business had embraced as a culture for so long. And what a great idea to illustrate, like to make even an animated film, whatever, where the bad boss is depicted exactly as a troll or an ogre or something like that, and really just illustrate, because that's kind of what that's. I mean, it's a pretty obvious metaphor, really. So if anybody out there doing HR training, I mean, I think maybe you ought to call Darrenn Canton and talk about that.
And I can just picture the mug that says world's best boss that he carries around with him everywhere.
Yes. See, your mind is already cooking. Because those things actually, I mean, I don't know if you ever sat through one, but they're as important as they are, they're also often just awful. Just
very
not done with any
dry.
imagination. You just feel like, oh my God, I got to sit through this, even though it's important. I got to sit through this terrible sort of, dull plotting thing.
And maybe there will be a revolution one of these days where that sort of thing becomes the norm. The parallel that my mind goes to immediately is airline safety videos, where they used to be very dry and people would fall asleep during them, and so people started making really funny ones and goofy ones. And I think the one that kind of started the whole trend was Virgin America's safety dance, where they had this huge elaborate dance routine for their safety video, and people actually went on to YouTube to watch it, even if they weren't flying anywhere. So
I haven't seen that. I'll have to go look it up. Well, let me ask you this question. We just have a few minutes left, but
sure.
So when you talk about we talked about illustration from the point of view of commissions, but so when you do these things, have you also looked at maybe developing your own story? Like maybe you could just do your own book and develop it. Like, is that the kind of thing you look to? Like, do you develop your own narrative for your characters that you could do something like that?
That is the $64,000 question, and I get that question very often. Some of the characters in my mind, there is a story there, but also I get bogged down by my own details and my own finicky critic in the back of my head, just constantly over analyzing everything. So one thing that I've been trying to do is finding another writer who can kind of distill the idea sludge in my head into something a little bit more workable.
Right.
Because when I try to do it, I just get a little overwhelmed by just the flood of ideas. And but that's something that I've always wanted to do is kind of create my own narrative.
So, but finding a good collaborator can be a real challenge, right?
It has been a challenge, and I haven't stopped looking, but it's been kind of touch and go over the years.
Well, is that part of like when you go the conference you mentioned in Pennsylvania? Do you connect with a lot of other people like you in other parts of the country that you could maybe?
Yeah, I've done a few collaborations with other artists before. Most of the artists who attend that show are more in the realism vein, more along the lines of, as you mentioned, Frank Frazetta, Boris Vallejo. They come from more of a traditional classical painting background, more oils and acrylics. So collaborating with artists at that event has, I've had a couple, but not quite so many.
Well, and your stuff is mostly watercolor and maybe pen and like things like that.
Yeah, mostly watercolor, a little bit of colored pencil and ink, but it's, I would say, like 95% watercolor.
Cool. Well, I look forward to like seeing more of your work in this setup, and we're going to wrap it up now, but just to say it again, Darrenn E. Canton, it will be at St. James Art Fair this year, Art Festival, in the LVA booth. First time LVA's had a booth. It was very important to us that being offered, we were glad that we were invited in, but it was very important to us that we be able to bring in a local artist who could be selling their work. And we're very happy you get to be the inaugural one. Assuming this turns into an annual thing, you get to be the inaugural artist.
It's a great honor. I'm still humbled by your choice. Thank you.
Well, and so we'll be down there. Come down and visit us. Come visit Darrenn Canton. As you can tell, he's actually a pretty nice guy.
That's debatable. I'm only being nice to you.
Well, I met you in person too, so he seems like a pretty nice guy. Come down to find out for yourself. That's the challenge. So Darrenn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.